The velvet upholstery of the Pullman car was the color of dried blood, a detail that seemed trivial until the moment it became prophetic. Violet Lambert pressed her cheek against the cool glass, watching the Wyoming landscape blur into a canvas of scorched ochre and brittle sagebrush. The heat shimmered off the iron rails in dizzying waves, mirroring the unease coiling in her stomach. For 3 days, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels had been a lullaby of escape. Now it sounded like a countdown. She knew they were on the train. She hadn't seen them, but she felt their presence, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a cold draft in the opulent claustrophobic car. They were professionals, predators, who moved with the quiet confidence of men accustomed to wielding power in the shadows. The first was a man with a face like a polished riverstone, smooth and impassive. He took the seat opposite her, his tailored suit a stark anomaly in the dusty West. He did not speak, merely unfolded a newspaper, the rustle of the pages an unnerving counterpoint to the train's cadence. The second man, younger and broader, blocked the aisle, his smile a thin, cruel slash in his handsome face. "Miss Lambert." The first man said, his voice as dry as the paper he held. "Mr. Blackwell sends his regards. He is deeply disappointed in your decision to travel without an escort." Violet's heart hammered against her ribs. She kept her gaze fixed on the window, her reflection a pale, ghostly mask. "I don't know any Mr. Blackwell." The younger man chuckled a low, unpleasant sound. "Oh, I think you do. The man whose hospitality you fled in Chicago. The man whose private business you so rudely interrupted." The memory seared through her. Richard Blackwell. His face illuminated by a gas lamp, his hand raising a heavy crystal decanter, bringing it down with sickening force on the head of the union organizer. The man had crumpled to the Persian rug, a dark stain spreading beneath his head. Blackwell had looked up then, his eyes meeting hers across the room, and his expression had been one of mild annoyance, as if she were a servant who had dropped a tray. "He wishes you to return." The older man continued folding his newspaper with precise, deliberate movements. "To rest. You've had a trying time. Your father is very concerned." The mention of her father was a fresh twist of the knife. He had been the first to betray her, dismissing her story as hysteria, choosing his business partner over his own daughter. "I am not going back." Violet said, her voice steadier than she felt. The younger man's smile vanished. He took a step forward, his bulk crowding her, the scent of bay rum and menace filling the small space. That wasn't a request. He reached for her, and Violet reacted, shoving her valise into his chest and scrambling toward the rear of the car. Passengers gasped, but no one moved to help. The men were too well dressed, their authority too palpable. They were gentlemen, and she was a hysterical woman. She burst through the door onto the narrow platform between the cars, the wind tearing at her hair, the roar of the train deafening. The younger man was right behind her. He grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh. She struggled, kicking and twisting, her expensive traveling dress ripping at the seams. "There's no need for this," the older man said, appearing on the platform behind them, his composure infuriatingly intact. He reached out not for her, but for the silver locket at her throat. "Mr. Blackwell thought you might have left this behind." The locket was her last gift from her mother, its surface worn smooth by years of her touch. He ripped it from her neck, the delicate chain snapping and biting into her skin. No. The cry was torn from her, a raw sound of anguish. As the man's fingers closed around the locket, Violet's desperation gave her a final surge of strength. She twisted, pulling the younger man off balance. For a moment, all three of them teetered on the edge of the swaying platform. The older man pushed. It was not a violent shove, but a calculated, decisive act. Violet's feet left the platform. The world became a dizzying blur of sky and earth. Her last coherent thought was of the silver locket, a tiny glint of light, falling back into the train car as it sped away, carrying the last piece of her old life with it. The impact with the gravel embankment was a brutal, jarring explosion of pain. She tumbled rocks and thorns, tearing at her skin, her head striking something hard. The world went dark, then swam back into a hazy, pain-filled focus. The distant whistle of the departing train was a mournful cry, fading into the vast, indifferent silence of the coming night. Crimson sunset painted the sky as she crawled, instinct driving her away from the tracks, blood seeping through her fingers where she clutched her side. She clutched the broken chain still hanging around her neck, her lips forming a single whispered word. Mama. Then consciousness slipped from her grasp. Braden Foster squinted against the setting sun, pulling back on the reins of his dappled gray stallion. Something unusual had caught his eye near the railroad tracks, a splash of color against the dusty landscape, a crumpled heap of fabric where there should have been only sagebrush and stone. Drawing closer, he realized with a start that it was a woman lying motionless beside the steel rails. "Whoa, Storm." He called to his horse, dismounting with a practiced ease that belied the slight, persistent ache in his left leg. His spurs jingled as his boots hit the ground, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. The woman was a sorry sight. Her fine clothing, though damaged, spoke of a wealth and breeding that stood out starkly against the rugged frontier. Her face was bruised, a nasty gash bled along her temple, and her breathing was shallow. He noted the dark bruises forming around her wrists and the torn fingernails, clear signs of a struggle. This was no accident. With gentle hands, Braden carefully turned her over. She moaned softly, her eyelids fluttering. Pain-clouded blue eyes struggled to focus on his face. She was semi-conscious, whispering a name, her fingers tangled in the remnants of a broken chain at her neck. The raw emotional pain in that simple gesture struck him more forcefully than her physical injuries. This was a person in deep distress, not just a victim of circumstance. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" He asked, his voice low and steady. "Who?" She managed her voice barely a whisper. Braden slid one arm beneath her shoulders and another under her knees, lifting her with the utmost care. Her body felt fragile in his arms, like a wounded bird. "Name's Braden Foster," he said, his deep voice gentle. "Looks like your journey's with me now." He carried her to his horse, positioning her as comfortably as possible before mounting behind her. With one strong arm holding her secure against his chest, he clicked his tongue, urging Storm toward his homestead. As they rode, she drifted in and out of consciousness, shivering against him. He pulled his worn leather duster tighter around her slender frame. His cabin appeared on the horizon as the first stars emerged. It wasn't much a sturdy two-room structure with a small stable attached, but it was clean and warm. He'd built it with his own hands after the war, seeking a solitude that could quiet the ghosts of Antietam and Gettysburg. He hadn't expected the world to follow him here. "Almost there," he murmured, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "Just hold on." Inside, he laid her gently on his bed, the scent of pine pitch, old leather, and wood smoke filling the air. He stoked the dying embers in the fireplace before fetching water and clean cloths. He'd learned field medicine in the war skills he'd hoped never to use again. The woman's eyes opened as he approached with the basin. Fear flashed across her face, and she tried to push herself up. "Easy now," Braden soothed, keeping his distance. "You're safe here. I found you by the tracks. You're hurt pretty bad." "The train," she whispered, wincing as she touched her temple. "They pushed me." Her words trailed off as pain overtook her again. He moved closer, showing his palms in a gesture of peace. "I need to clean these wounds, ma'am. I promise I'll be proper about it." She studied him for a long moment, her gaze sharp and intelligent despite the pain. Finally, she gave a slight nod. Her trust, however tentative, felt like a precious thing. "Violet," she said softly. "My name is Violet Lambert." "Miss Lambert?" he acknowledged with a respectful nod. "I'm going to take care of these cuts now." As he worked, he noticed how she flinched at his touch, a reaction born of more than just physical pain. Still, she remained composed, only the occasional sharp intake of breath betraying her agony. "You have a doctor's touch, Mr. Foster?" She observed, her voice a little stronger. "War teaches a man things he'd rather not know," he replied simply. "Which side?" she asked, and then immediately shook her head. "I'm sorry, that was improper of me." "Union," he answered anyway. But that was another life. Out here a man is judged by how he lives now, not where he fought. When he had finished cleaning and bandaging her wounds, he fetched her a cup of coffee laced with a touch of whiskey for the pain. "I'll sleep by the fire," he said, gathering a blanket. "You take the bed. Tomorrow, when you're feeling stronger, you can tell me what happened. Or not. Your choice." Violet watched him move around the cabin. He was a tall, broad-shouldered stranger, his movements efficient, his manner reserved, but kind. In the golden glow of the firelight, she saw the flecks of gray at his temples and the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of hardship. There was a quiet frustration in the way he favored his left leg, a stiffness he tried to conceal. "Thank you," she said softly. Most men would have ridden past. Braden paused, his back to her. "No decent man would leave anyone to die alone in the wilderness, Miss Lambert. There aren't many decent men left in this world, Mr. Foster." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Get some rest. You're safe here tonight." As exhaustion claimed, her Violet's last thought was that for the first time in months, she actually believed those words. She was safe. For now. On a small shelf near the fireplace, a framed tintype caught the firelight. It showed a younger Braden in a Union uniform, his arm around a smiling young man who shared his features. He slept near the fire, but Violet knew from the tension in his posture that his rest would be fitful, haunted by ghosts she couldn't yet name. Dawn broke with golden fingers stretching across the sky. Braden had slept little, his senses alert to every gust of wind outside and the occasional whimper from his unexpected guest as nightmares disturbed her sleep. He rose quietly, stoked the fire, and began preparing a simple breakfast. The familiar routine calmed him, helping to organize his thoughts about the woman in his bed and the trouble that had so violently thrown her into his life. Violet woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. For a moment, disorientation gripped her, panic rising in her chest. Then the events of the previous evening rushed back: the train, the attack, the fall, and the quiet, solitary man who had found her. She pushed herself up slowly, wincing at the pain that radiated from every part of her body. "Morning," Braden said, turning from the stove. "How are you feeling?" "As though I've been thrown from a train," she replied, attempting a smile that faltered. "Which is appropriate, I suppose." He brought her a cup of coffee, keeping a respectful distance. "Strong, black, and sweet. Good medicine." Violet accepted the cup gratefully. The warmth spread through her cold fingers. "I need to get to Cheyenne," she said, her voice firm despite her weakness. "There are men looking for me. Dangerous men. I'm putting you at risk just by being here." Braden sat on a chair across from the bed. Cheyenne's a 3-day ride. You're in no condition to travel. And what kind of trouble are you in? She hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. Trust didn't come easily anymore. But he had saved her life. I witnessed something I shouldn't have, she finally said. A murder in Chicago. The killer, Richard Blackwell, is a powerful man. The police are in his pocket. Braden's expression remained impassive, but his eyes hardened. So you ran. I had no choice. He sent men after me. They found me on the train to Cheyenne. She touched a bruise on her cheek. They pushed me. They'll backtrack once they realize I'm not dead. I have to keep moving. Braden stood pacing the small room, his limp more pronounced in the morning chill. You need to heal first. My nearest neighbor is 20 miles away. No one will find you here for a few days. I can't impose, she protested. Miss Lambert, I'm not in the habit of saving people just to send them off to die elsewhere. His voice was firm. Rest today. Eat. Tomorrow we can talk about getting you safely where you need to go. Reluctantly, she nodded. The pain was a persuasive argument. As she ate the simple fare he provided, she studied him more closely. His cabin was sparse but clean, a reflection of the man himself. A bookshelf caught her attention, filled not with dime novels, but with Shakespeare, Dickens, and Homer. On the shelf sat the tintype she'd glimpsed last night, Braden and another soldier brothers, perhaps their faces full of a youthful hope that was now absent from the older man's eyes. He was haunted, she realized, by more than just the war. He was a man nursing a private grief in this vast, empty land. Restlessness eventually drove her from the bed. Moving gingerly, she examined the tintype. The resemblance between the two men was strong. Brothers, certainly. A sudden sound approaching hoofbeats sent a surge of panic through her. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace just as the door opened. Braden stepped inside, stopping short at the sight of her brandishing the weapon. Planning on adding a head injury to my list of ailments? He asked mildly. Violet lowered the poker, embarrassment replacing fear. I heard a horse. I thought... Just me and Storm, he assured her. Then, noting her distress, he said, You're safe here, Violet. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something in the way he said it eased her tension. I'm sorry, she said. Living in fear becomes a habit. A habit you'll need to break someday, he replied, hanging his hat on a peg. No one should live like that. The next morning, Braden announced he needed to ride into Riverdale for supplies. I can send a telegram to your aunt in San Francisco, he offered. Let her know you're alive. Violet penned a brief, deliberately vague note. As she handed it to him, she cautioned, Be careful. They might be watching the telegraph offices. I'll be careful, he promised. Bar the door after I leave. Don't open it unless you hear my voice. After he departed, the cabin felt unnervingly quiet. The hours passed slowly. As the sun began to set, she saw him riding back, his posture rigid with tension. She unbarred the door as he dismounted, his face grim. What is it? She asked. 2 well-dressed men in town, he said, setting down his saddlebags. Not locals. They were showing a photograph around a photograph of you, offering a reward. Violet sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. They know I'm alive. They know you survived the fall, he corrected. But they don't know where you are. Yet. He began unpacking his supplies, his movements deliberate. They're watching the stage routes, the railroad stations. And I overheard them asking some odd questions at the saloon. questions about old Union Army Registry supply routes during the war. The detail was so specific, so out of place, that it sent a fresh chill through Violet. Why would they care about that? "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "They've cut off every escape." Braden turned to face her, his expression resolute. "Not everyone. They're looking for a lone woman. They're looking on the main routes." He took a deep breath, the decision settling in his eyes. "I'll take you to San Francisco." Violet stared at him, bewildered. "That's nearly 1,000 miles. Your ranch, your life." "My life is my own to decide what to do with," he stated plainly. "I know the territory. We can take trails they won't know, avoid the towns. They're looking for a frightened woman from the city. They won't be looking for her riding with a backcountry rancher." He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "Those men on the train took something from you, that locket. And those men in town, they're not just looking for a witness. There's something more to this. I won't let them find you." She knew she should refuse, knew she was dragging this good man into her nightmare. But the alternative, facing her pursuers alone, was a death sentence. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for me?" Braden looked over at the tintype on the shelf. A shadow of immense sorrow crossed his face. "During the war," he began, his voice low, "I lost my brother Thomas. The official report said it was a battlefield accident, a supply explosion behind our lines. It never sat right with me. He was too careful." He paused, his jaw tight. Some men in this world think they can act without consequence, that power and money put them above decency. Men like Blackwell. Maybe I can't get justice for my brother, but I can damn well make sure a man like that doesn't get what he wants now. His reasoning was not about her, not entirely. It was about a deeper wound, a quest for a justice he'd long been denied. And in that moment, their separate flights from injustice merged into a single, desperate journey. "We leave at first light," he said. The storm had turned the Sweetwater River into a churning, muddy torrent. For 2 days, they had ridden hard, pushing northwest into the rugged foothills, the vast Wyoming sky stretching over them like a judgment. Now this raging obstacle blocked their path. "We can't cross here," Braden said, his voice tight with frustration as he surveyed the dangerous waters. "There's a bridge 10 miles north, but it's too close to the main trails. Too risky." "Is there no other way?" Violet asked, her mare Penny shifting nervously beneath her. The roar of the water was a physical force, a testament to nature's raw power. Braden scanned the landscape, his eyes narrowed in calculation. "There's a narrower point about 5 miles downstream. Banks are steep. It'll be a fight." "I'll take a fight over a trap," she replied, her resolve hardening. The journey had already begun to strip away her city-bred fragility, replacing it with a pragmatic grit she hadn't known she possessed. They picked their way downstream on the ground soft and treacherous from the rain. When they reached the crossing, it was as Braden had described, a narrow chasm where the river was forced into a violent, concentrated rush. "I'll go first with Storm," he said, dismounting to check the cinches on his saddle. "He's steady. Test the depth. You follow exactly in my path. Don't look at the water, look at the far bank. Understand?" Violet nodded, her throat too dry to speak. She watched as he urged the powerful stallion into the churning current. Storm hesitated, but Braden's calm voice and steady hand gave the animal confidence. The water rose to the horse's chest, pulling and sucking at its legs, but they moved with a slow, powerful determination. When Braden reached the far bank, he turned and waved her across. Taking a deep breath, Violet guided Penny into the river. The cold shocked her, seeping through her boots and trousers. The mare panicked for a moment, but Violet kept her voice low and soothing her hands firm on the reins, just as Braden had taught her. They were halfway across when a large, half-submerged log carried by the current slammed into Penny's legs. The horse screamed, rearing in terror. Violet was thrown from the saddle, the world flipping upside down before the icy water closed over her head. The current seized her, tumbling her like a rag doll, slamming her against submerged rocks. She fought for the surface, gasped for air, and was dragged under again. Violet. Braden's shout was a distant, desperate sound. She saw him through a blur of water and panic, a frantic figure on the far bank. He was racing along the river's edge, his face a mask of horror, trying to get ahead of her. Her strength was failing, the cold leeching the life from her limbs. Just as her vision began to darken, her hand snagged on a low-hanging willow branch. She clung to it, the bark digging into her palms, the current pulling relentlessly at her body. The branch creaked, groaning under the strain. "Hold on," Braden yelled. He had tied his lariat to a sturdy cottonwood and was wading into the dangerous water, the rope tied around his waist, fighting his way toward her. "It's breaking," she cried, her fingers numb. The branch snapped. She was swept away again, but in that same instant, Braden's hand closed around her wrist like a steel band. The current yanked them both, but the rope held. With a great grunting effort that spoke of sheer desperation, he hauled them toward the shore. They collapsed on the muddy bank, gasping for breath. Violet coughed up river water, shivering uncontrollably as Braden held her, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her back. "I thought I'd lost you," he said, his voice ragged with an emotion that went far beyond a rescuer's concern. She turned in his arms, her soaked hair streaming water. "You found me once by the tracks." She managed her teeth, chattering. "Seems you're determined to keep finding me." A raw, shaky laugh escaped him, a sound of pure relief. "Stubborn woman. Can't you stay out of trouble for 5 minutes?" He helped her to her feet, his hands gentle but firm. They found Penny grazing calmly on the other side, having made it across after the fall. Braden built a fire with practiced speed, his movements urgent. As Violet changed into dry clothes behind a hastily arranged blanket, she knew that something profound had shifted between them in the violent waters of the river. He hadn't just rescued a stranger. He had fought for her life, with a ferocity that was deeply personal. The bond forged in that crossing was stronger than any rope, a silent acknowledgement that their journey was now irrevocably intertwined. They were no longer just a protector and his charge. They were partners in a desperate flight for survival. The days bled into a new rhythm, dictated by the sun and the terrain. They rode through the vast, grassy plains of Wyoming, where the sky was an endless blue bowl, and the wind was a constant companion. Then came the claustrophobic pine forests and granite peaks of the Rocky Mountains, a landscape of breathtaking beauty and sudden, unforgiving danger. They spoke little, but their silence was companionable. Braden taught her the language of the wilderness, how to read animal tracks, how to find water, how to move without a sound. She was an apt pupil, her mind sharp and observant. In return, she shared pieces of her old world, reading aloud in the evenings from a small volume of Shakespeare she'd managed to save her voice, a melodious counterpoint to the crackling campfire. Her past came out in fragments. One evening, as Braden gently treated a rope burn on Storm's leg, she spoke of her fiancé. "Edward loved horses," she said, her voice distant. Or rather, he loved the status that owning fine horses gave him. She fell silent, and Braden didn't press, but he understood the betrayal was about more than just a man. It was about the crumbling of an entire world built on false appearances. Braden's own history remained locked away, emerging only in his sleep. Some nights Violet would wake to hear him murmuring, caught in a nightmare. The words were always the same: faulty charge, Thomas, traitor. She never asked him about it, sensing the wound was too deep, too raw to be touched by questions. They skirted towns, Braden's instincts guiding them. But one day necessity forced them to a small, isolated trading post for salt and flour. While Braden went inside, Violet waited with the horses, hidden in a stand of aspens. A lone prospector ambled out of the post and, seeing her, tipped his dusty hat. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, squinting at her. "Funny thing, fellas in there asking questions, not about gold neither." Violet's blood ran cold. What kind of questions? Asking about a woman traveling through. But they was also asking the storekeep about old military maps of the area, something about supply routes for Fort Laramie during the war. Oddest thing for a couple of city slickers to be interested in. The prospector ambled on, oblivious to the bomb he had just dropped. When Braden returned, his face grim, she told him what the old man had said. "They're not just following your path, Violet." Braden set his eyes dark with a dawning, terrible suspicion. "They're retracing something else, something old." The mention of military supply routes had struck a nerve, connecting his brother's death to her present danger in a way that was too chilling to be a coincidence. The land changed again as they crossed into the Great Basin, a stark alien expanse of salt flats that shimmered under the sun. The journey became an endurance test against heat and thirst. Here, under the vast, empty sky, their isolation was absolute, their reliance on each other total. One evening, as they made camp, Braden finally spoke of the tin type. "That was my brother Thomas," he said, staring into the fire. "He was a quartermaster's clerk, meticulous. He saw things, details others missed." He paused, his voice thick with old grief. "He wrote to me a week before he died. Said he'd found a discrepancy in the munitions inventory, faulty rifles being signed for as new stock. He said there was a traitor in the ranks, getting rich off soldiers' lives." He looked at Violet, his eyes filled with a pain that spanned a decade. The supply depot exploded a few days later. Thomas was killed. The investigation called it an accident. I never believed it. Violet listened, her heart aching for him, and the prospector's words echoing in her mind. Military maps, supply routes. A terrible, unbelievable pattern was beginning to emerge. Richard Blackwell, a man who profited from unsafe factory conditions, was exactly the kind of man who would have profited from a war. The Sierra Nevada loomed ahead, their final greatest obstacle. As they began their ascent, an early blizzard descended with shocking speed, trapping them in a high mountain pass. They found refuge in an abandoned shepherd's hut, a tiny stone structure against the storm's fury. For 3 days, the world was nothing but the howling wind and swirling snow. Trapped in the cramped, cold space, the walls they had built around their hearts crumbled. "I am so afraid," Violet confessed one night, her voice a near whisper in the roaring dark. "Not just of Blackwell. I'm afraid of what comes after. If we make it, I have nothing. No one." "That's not true." Braden set his voice a low anchor in the storm. He moved closer, his arm going around her shoulders, sharing his warmth. "You have me." The words hung between them, simple and profound. In the flickering firelight, she saw not a haunted rancher, but a man of deep, quiet strength, a man who had chosen to stand by her when the rest of the world had abandoned her. She leaned into him, and he turned her face to his. The kiss was not born of passion, but of something deeper, a shared solitude, a desperate hope for a future, in a world that had tried to erase them both. It was a promise made in the heart of a blizzard, a confession of feelings that had grown silently along the trail. When the storm finally broke, they emerged into a world of blinding white and brilliant sun. The beauty of it was breathtaking, but their respite was short-lived. As they descended the western slope, they reached a small mining settlement, a place called Providence. They needed supplies, and the risk felt necessary. The town was nearly deserted, most of its inhabitants having fled the early snow. The innkeeper, a kindly woman with weary eyes, welcomed them. As she served them a hot meal, she studied them closely. "You came over the high pass?" she asked. "We did," Braden confirmed. "Got caught in the storm." The woman nodded. "You're lucky. 2 men were waiting for you on this side. Left just yesterday, heading down toward Sacramento. Said the snow had likely done their job for them." She leaned closer, her voice low. "They weren't good men. I overheard them talking. They weren't just looking for a woman. They were looking for a ghost. Said their boss, a Mr. Blackwell, wanted to make sure a story from the war stayed buried, along with anyone who might remember it. The net hadn't just been cast behind them. It was waiting ahead. The blizzard had been a blessing, a temporary shield. But now it was gone. Blackwell wasn't just chasing a witness. He was hunting the last thread that could unravel his entire treacherous history. And he was closer than ever. They pushed hard, a silent urgency propelling them down the western slope of the Sierras. The innkeeper's warning echoed in their minds that the trap was set ahead of them. In a small settlement at the foot of the mountains, they sold their horses and used the money to buy passage on a dusty stagecoach bound for Sacramento, hoping to lose themselves among other travelers. It was a gamble, trading their solitude for the anonymity of a crowd. The gamble failed. As the stagecoach rattled into a way station, a single rider was waiting. He wasn't one of the men from the train, but he had the same cold, professional air. He watched the passengers disembark, his eyes scanning each face before locking onto Violet. There was no surprise in his gaze, only grim satisfaction. Braden saw it too. "Get back inside," he hissed, pushing Violet toward the coach. But it was too late. 2 more men emerged from the station house, blocking their path. One of them was the younger, handsome man from the train. "Miss Lambert," he said with a chilling smile. "Mr. Blackwell was so hoping you'd make it through the snow. He's arranged a more private form of transport for the remainder of your journey." He gestured with his pistol toward a dark carriage parked behind the building. Braden stepped in front of Violet, his body a shield. "She's not going anywhere with you." The man's smile widened. "Mr. Foster, isn't it, the solitary rancher? We know all about you. We even know about your brother Thomas. A tragic accident that was. It would be a shame for another Foster to meet with a similar tragedy." The threat, so personal and so specific, struck Braden like a physical blow. This wasn't just about Violet anymore. It was the culmination of a decade of unanswered questions and unavenged grief. Before Braden could react, the innkeeper from Providence, a stout man named Miller, who had been a passenger on the coach, stepped forward. "Now see here," he blustered, "you can't just accost folks in broad daylight." One of the men backhanded Miller across the face, sending him sprawling into the dust. The other passengers scurried away, wanting no part of the confrontation. In the ensuing chaos, Braden acted. He shoved Violet hard toward the back of the station house. "Run. There's an abandoned silver mine a mile up that canyon. Go." He drew the pistol he'd kept concealed and fired not to kill, but to create a diversion. The men scattered, returning fire. Violet didn't hesitate. She ran, her heart pounding, the sound of gunshots echoing behind her. The canyon was a desolate, rocky scar in the earth. She found the mine entrance a dark maw in the hillside, framed by rotting timbers. She plunged into the darkness, stumbling deeper into the earth, and the air growing cold and damp, smelling of stone and decay. She found a side tunnel and squeezed into the narrow space, praying Braden would follow. Minutes later, she heard footsteps. Not the steady tread of Braden, but the cautious scraping sounds of hunters. They had a lantern, its yellow light casting monstrous dancing shadows on the tunnel walls. "She came in here," one of them said. "Blackwell wants her alive if possible." Suddenly, a new voice echoed from the mine's entrance, amplified by the stone walls. It was a voice of cultured, chilling authority. "That preference has expired. Find her." Richard Blackwell had come himself. The lantern light grew brighter as the men moved deeper into the mine. Then from another tunnel, a shadow detached itself from the darkness. It was Braden. He put a finger to his lips, his face grim in the faint light. He had circled around and entered through a ventilation shaft. He pointed down the tunnel they were in, then back toward the entrance. A whispered plan: he would draw them deeper, she would circle back and escape. She shook her head, refusing to leave him, but his look was fierce, commanding. He kicked a loose rock, the sound clattering through the tunnels. The lantern light immediately swung in his direction. "Over here," a voice shouted. As they pursued the sound, Violet slipped from her hiding place and ran toward the entrance. She was almost there when a figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking her path. It was Richard Blackwell. He held a pistol, and his face, illuminated by the distant lantern, was a calm, placid mask of evil. "Miss Lambert," he said smoothly, "did you really think it would be so easy?" At that moment, Braden emerged from the tunnel behind Blackwell, his own pistol leveled. "Let her go, Blackwell." Blackwell turned slowly, his lack of surprise unnerving. Braden Foster, the grieving brother. How fitting that it should end here in the dark, just like it did for young Thomas. A thunderstorm had broken outside, and a distant rumble of thunder echoed through the mine. "You see, this was never just about her." Blackwell continued, his voice conversational. "She was simply the loose end. The real problem was always the memory of your brother. He was an honest man, a dangerous thing to be. He discovered I was replacing Army-issue Spencer rifles with faulty surplus, saving the Union a pretty penny, and making myself a fortune. He had to be silenced." "You killed him." Braden snarled, his voice a low growl of pure hatred. "A necessary business expense," Blackwell replied with a shrug. "Just as the man she saw me kill was. A former soldier from Thomas's unit who had started asking questions. Your brother was a hero, Mr. Foster, and he died for it." He then turned his cold eyes to Violet. "And you, my dear. The greatest tragedy is that you never understood your own father's role in this. He wasn't just my partner in Chicago. He was my silent partner during the war. He knew all about the rifles. When you came to him with your story, he chose his fortune over his daughter. He was the one who suggested I simply dispose of you." The revelation struck Violet with the force of a physical blow, a betrayal so profound it stole the air from her lungs. Her own father. Blackwell smiled, savoring the moment. "Now I believe we have reached the end of our story." He raised his pistol toward Violet. Braden fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Blackwell staggered back, not hit, but his aim thrown off. His own shot went wide, ricocheting off the rock wall. Braden lunged, tackling Blackwell, and the two men crashed to the floor of the mine, struggling for control of Blackwell's pistol. It was Braden's chance for revenge, the moment he had unknowingly waited for over a decade. He could end it right there, kill the man who had murdered his brother and destroyed so many lives. His face was contorted with rage, his hands tightening around Blackwell's throat. "Braden, no." Violet screamed, her voice cutting through his haze of fury. Don't become him. We need justice, not vengeance." Her words reached him. He looked at Blackwell choking beneath him, then at Violet, her face streaked with tears and dirt, pleading with him to hold on to the decency he had taught her still existed. The rage in his eyes warred with the man he was. With a guttural cry, he slammed Blackwell's head against the stone floor, knocking him unconscious, but not dead. He stood up, breathing heavily, the choice made. Outside, the storm broke in full fury. As if summoned by the gunfire, figures appeared at the mine entrance, a federal marshal and a posse of deputies alerted by the innkeeper Miller. Justice had arrived, not at the end of Braden's gun, but carried on the word of a decent stranger. In the weeks that followed, the world righted itself. In a sterile San Francisco federal office, Violet gave her testimony. Braden stood by her side, his presence a silent, unwavering support. The federal marshal listened, his expression grim, as the pieces of Richard Blackwell's corrupt empire were laid bare, from war profiteering and the murder of Thomas Foster to the countless other crimes committed in the name of greed. "Your testimony, Miss Lambert, along with evidence we've been gathering for months, will put Blackwell away for the rest of his life," the marshal confirmed. "And your father. He's been taken into custody as well. His ledgers tell a story he can no longer deny." The news of her father's arrest brought not triumph, but a quiet, aching sorrow. It was the final closing of a door, the definitive end of the life she had once known. She found her Aunt Margaret in a charming bookshop on Montgomery Street, a haven of paper and ink that smelled of home. The reunion was a tearful, joyous collision of past and future. Margaret, a woman of sharp wit and boundless spirit, embraced not only her long-lost niece, but the quiet, steadfast man who had brought her there. They stayed with Margaret in her cozy apartment above the shop. San Francisco, with its fog-shrouded hills and bustling streets, became a place of healing. The nightmares began to fade, replaced by the comforting reality of safety and the promise of a new beginning. Braden, however, was restless. He was a man of the open country, and the city, for all its comforts, felt like a cage. One afternoon, he found Violet by the bay, watching the ships glide through the Golden Gate. "I've been looking at land," he said, his voice quiet. "North of here, in Sonoma County, good land for raising horses." Violet turned to him, her heart catching. "You're staying?" "If you'll have me," he replied simply. "I told you on that mountain that my journey was with you. I meant it." He took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "I want to build a life with you, Violet. Not one of running and hiding, but one of planting and growing." He didn't have a ring, only the sincerity in his eyes, and the promise of a future forged in fire and loyalty. Her answer was in the tears that traced paths through the lingering trail dust on her cheeks, and in the way she wrapped her arms around his neck, finally home. 1 year later, the Sonoma Ranch was a tapestry of rolling green hills and the scent of wildflowers. The house they had built was modest, but sturdy, its wide porch facing the evening sun. Life had settled into a peaceful rhythm of hard work and quiet joy. This evening, as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Braden walked into the main room. He was carrying the small leather-bound travel bag he had carried across the country. From it, he carefully removed the tintype of himself and his brother Thomas. For the entire journey, and for the years since, it had remained packed away, a private grief too heavy for daily display. Slowly he walked to the stone fireplace, the heart of their new home. He placed the tintype on the center of the mantelpiece. It was not a burial, but a resurrection, an acceptance of the past and its integration into the present. He was no longer just the grieving brother. He was a husband, a rancher, a man who had found peace. Violet came to stand beside him, placing her hand on his. He looked at her, then at the smiling face in the photograph, and for the first time, a smile touched his own lips, free from the shadow of sorrow. He had not gotten his revenge, but he had found justice, and in doing so had freed not only Thomas's memory, but himself. She watched his face, her heart full. Then she took his free hand and gently placed it on the slight curve of her belly. "Our family is growing," she whispered. Braden's gaze dropped his expression, shifting from peaceful remembrance to stunned, breathtaking wonder. He looked back at her, his eyes asking a question his voice could not yet form. She nodded, tears of pure happiness shining in her eyes. "A new journey for us, Braden. Due in the spring." He gathered her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that belied his strength, his face buried in her hair. All the miles, all the fear, all the loss had led them here to this moment of profound and perfect hope. From the ashes of their old lives, something new and beautiful was taking root. The promise of the future, once a distant, impossible dream, was now a quiet, certain stirring of new life, held safe in the sanctuary they had built together.